Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. I want to start off by welcoming everyone to this virtual gathering. It is an educational webinar, and it brings us from all parts of Oregon. So this is a statewide webinar. I want to introduce myself, Christy Munoz, preferred pronouns she, her, ella. I work with United Way of the Columbia-Willamette as the climate resilience and disaster response lead here. We service the Clark, Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas County region, but we do have two statewide initiatives, which one of them is what you're joining us for today, which is our inclusive messaging planning grant work. And you know, currently I'm speaking from my living space, which resides on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, and Chinook. And I want to offer this moment to recognize these nations whose traditional territory I'm speaking from, and bringing recognition to the other nations whose lands you're all standing on as well. So we acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And then I also want to root us with kind of where we're coming from, myself and some of my colleagues here with United Way. Our mission, we hope to improve lives and strengthen communities and advance equity by mobilizing the carrying power of people across our region. So that's the big picture. But how do we do that? So we are working to create a future where our kids and families are free from poverty, so they're free to reach their potential. And our priority is addressing the root causes of poverty. And we do this by centering racial equity in our work, because research shows that families of color are facing social and economic disparities that deter the progress of our community as a whole. So by addressing those disparities, we're hoping to disrupt that cycle of poverty and create a more equitable and inclusive region for all of us here in our state. I also want to take a moment and root us in acknowledging just the support that all of us are bringing, to address our vulnerable communities, specifically the communities and wildfire survivors in this last year. Props to all the organizations who are currently already developing culturally competent and accessible materials and presentations for their communities. Gratitude to the local LTRGs, VOADs, COADs, disaster case managers that are working around the clock to just try to support our communities trying to come back from a climate crisis. And of course, firefighters and truly everyone in the multi-sector, right? So the nonprofit sector, government sector, mutual aid groups, and also philanthropy, where we're all trying our very best to bring back our state to a place of resilience. So I will ask to keep the questions to the end so that our co-hosts can move forward with just all of the amazing things they're going to share with you. And for those who just joined us, welcome. Please include your name and what county you're coming from, so we have an idea as to where you're hailing from. And we will also be including various links and following up with everyone with a pre-recorded version of this webinar, as well as some additional links as to how to stay involved. So without further ado, I'm going to leave it up to Nika and Alex to introduce themselves before we jump into the presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexander Fajardo. Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us to be here to share a little bit of our experience. I am the director of a local nonprofit community-based organization in California, serving 2 counties in San Bernardino, Riverside counties, Southern California. I will be sharing more about our experience, and I'm happy to be here.
Hi, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nika Tahan, and I currently work as a part-time consultant doing evaluation, research, and strategic planning. Previous to that, I worked on the Listos campaign, Preparedness Campaign, out of the Office of Emergency Services in California. I've already seen some folks on here shout out CERT, and so just wanted to say I see y'all, and I've worked a lot with CERT, AmeriCorps, and other programs, service and volunteer programs as well, within the disaster preparedness world.
Thank you both. So let's pull up that presentation and get in on this virtual gathering to learn a little bit more about what statewide inclusive disaster preparedness could look like, and how is it that we can bring along the public sector. And just so everyone knows, we actually have had 3 webinars set up to start these conversations. So this is our public sector webinar, and earlier today we had our nonprofit sector webinar that was also really well attended statewide. And then we're also hosting one, and we're invited to offer one specifically for Oregon Health Authority to talk about and dive in more deeply around the intersection of disaster messaging and engagement and public health and what that looks like. So next slide, please. Thank you. So why inclusive disaster preparedness planning, and why does this matter? So just to ground us to, this conversation started for our United Way and our partners last year. And it was through dialogue and relationship building that we started to learn more and have actually way more questions than answers at this point after last year's fires. It's been our communal experience that the 2020 disasters really highlighted the need for additional support for our communities of color, non-English speaking, and, you know, honestly, also our houseless community and our migrant community and other vulnerable communities who really want to be intentionally engaged in disaster preparedness planning and programming. This is a planning process. So this is a planning grant-based initiative. We are not starting anything. We are just really here to be learners and to try to understand how we can move forward cross-sectorally. And more importantly, we were, privileged enough to get this planning process started through the support of the Community Rebuilding Fund of OCF, Oregon Community Foundations. And then I also wanted to mention through these conversations, some of the thoughts and items that came up repetitively with a lot of our partners statewide that we supported through funding, but also through relationship building and dialogue. We started to wonder, how is it that we, especially during blue skies or basically no climate crisis months, how can we become better listeners and learners and understanding the experiences of our community-based organizations, as well as in government and all of the other sectors involved, including, of course, philanthropy and mutual aid groups. We are, as a team, we're not attached to the outcome of this planning grant, but I do want to highlight that in this process, we want to center the experiences of community-based organizations, especially vulnerable communities. And we are also very curious, how is it that we can approach climate crisis planning or disaster planning with a bottom-up approach? So meaning, how can we get community input and develop more equitable and culturally competent messaging and planning initiatives for the full life cycle of a disaster? We really, before we start even thinking about how to fund and how to develop programmings, we reached out to our other United Ways, both nationally, and frankly, they really suggested we need to talk to all of the sectors and we need to collect information and better understand the perspectives of how we can see what are some gaps that are happening for our state. I'll go ahead and let Nika and Alex take it from here.
Thanks, Christy, for that really lovely introduction. So just wanted to quickly go over some of the learning objectives for this presentation. I think probably quite a few of you on this call already have an understanding of traditional emergency preparedness, but we'll go through kind of a brief explanation of that for folks who might not be familiar. We're going to do a little bit, hopefully, of a learning from other models, specifically the Listos California Emergency Preparedness Campaign. And then, at the end, we also want folks to kind of go away having a good understanding of why it's important to really intentionally and authentically engage community-based organizations into preparedness processes. So like I said, this section will just be covering a bit about the emergency preparedness kind of planning and processes. You can go to the next slide. Perfect. So again, for folks who might not know, kind of oftentimes some of the aspects that a lot of the public sector preparedness materials are based off of, and this by no means is a full comprehensive list. There's a lot of steps that go into it, a lot of planning that goes into it. But here, are a few things that sometimes can play a role in terms of creating materials. Oftentimes they might have a disaster type or emergency type focus. There's a lot of information that's also passed down from best practices from the national level down to the state. So FEMA best practices and information and understanding. There's oftentimes also a lot of feedback from local levels. So local emergency managers and planners back up to the state level and back then up to the federal government. There tends to be a solid focus on alert systems. This can be also really dependent on the local areas, but there's oftentimes kind of, at least a little bit of a focus of knowing what your alert systems are and making sure that you're signed up for them. And then, states, including Oregon, have really started to ensure that there's proper translation of materials and alerts, which is really wonderful and makes things a lot more accessible already to a lot of different folks. So next slide. So what we wanted to kind of share a little bit about is, knowing that there are some traditional steps to doing emergency preparedness. California attempted to, and I think was somewhat successful at, also trying to implement a different kind of way of doing emergency preparedness, specifically when focused on vulnerable communities and diverse communities. This preparedness campaign and effort was really, and we'll get to talk about this more, but it was really looking at how all sectors could come together, put resources together, and create materials that related differently to communities. So like I said, Listos was born from community feedback after years of devastating disasters. So on the state level, we were getting a lot of feedback from the county and even from smaller community level and different communities that some folks just were not getting the preparedness materials and resources that they were needing for lots of different reasons, including not having enough resources, not having properly translated materials, not having materials that not only were translated into other languages, but were also culturally relevant, issues with accessibility, how to reach folks in rural areas, lots of different populations with lots of different needs. And as we all know, there's so much to be done all of the time. It's so challenging when disasters are happening pretty much all of the time at this point that we have to respond to. I mean, we've all been in the middle of a 2-year-long emergency with COVID-19. It's really challenging to simultaneously, also focus on creating new systems of preparedness in particular. And so figuring out what were some other resources and ways that could get done. So the state of California, through both the governor's office and the state legislation, decided to invest $50 million into a public preparedness campaign with a goal to get 1 million diverse Californians disaster ready through community-centered programming and resources. So just to give also, kind of another layer and understanding of who all was involved. So even though this was, again, a statewide OES-led emergency campaign, there were lots of partners involved from all different levels. So we worked with nonprofits, the private sector, faith-based, public health departments, had a lot of really strong relationships with statewide media, worked with, as I mentioned before, service and volunteer-based organizations. So we had specific programming for CERT, the Listos program, and also AmeriCorps and other kind of volunteer-based organizations, worked with the community, and then also worked a lot with foundations as well for funding and for the creation of a lot of the research that ended up impacting, in the end, this kind of process and the process that we ended up going with. Next slide. So just a few things, a few final things on the state kind of side and what we kind of did as a campaign team, again, housed out of the Office of Emergency Services. We made sure that we did a landscape survey of as much of the existing materials as possible. So we did look at national best practices, what was happening at the state, what were the FEMA offerings, the state offerings, what were other larger organizations offering and doing. We partnered with universities so that we could have overlapped mapping for both types of disasters, likelihood of disaster, as well mapped on top of populations. So, how many folks potentially were in an area that was rural without internet, where X amount of people spoke Mandarin, and what kind of disaster and at what percentage was that going to be a likelihood, so that then folks on the ground and in the local communities could kind of tailor different materials and different methodologies based off of those communities. We worked across sectors to do research and report on messaging. So brought together folks, again, from all different sectors that had already been involved in both response and preparedness to talk about kind of what systems were already in place and potentially what was missing. And from that, what we gathered was there needs to be more funding. There needs to be a focus on materials and programming that needs to be a little bit different. And there needs to be, I think we all always know, coordination is so challenging to do when we're working with so many different people. Again, when we're talking about disasters, it's just a huge challenge. So continuing to try and develop better systems of coordination across those sectors. We developed community and language specific materials as well as brand new trainings. So Listos created its own 5, 15-minute, and then 1-hour disaster preparedness trainings, and then also developed materials in the most needed languages in California, as well as accessible materials and some other materials that we'll talk about moving forward. We granted with CBOs. So of that $50 million, all of it had to be granted out into community-based organizations. to actually do, well, I should say about 30 million of that went to community-based organizations, 20 million went to the volunteer and service organizations like CERT, AmeriCorps, and the Listos program. We also worked with paid media and different technological agencies to get the message across, including doing a statewide text emergency preparedness training. We also worked with 211 and utilized them a lot, and they provided some of the emergency preparedness information. As talked about a lot, service and volunteerism was a huge part of it, and then connected CBOs with emergency managers to begin discussing planning needs and partnerships. So although this was an emergency preparedness campaign, obviously, probably a lot of us on this call know that planning is a huge part of that. And so wanting to ensure that relationships were being built and facilitated in kind of healthy and empowering ways between communities and local emergency managers. In terms of impact, so there were 300 plus CBOs involved throughout this process. Again, like I said, most of the funds, if not all of the funds, were granted out and then sub-granted out. We reached more than 3 million Californians with this information, actually close to 4 million, which was close to 4 times our original goal. This doesn't include the over 13 million individuals that we also ended up getting materials, specific COVID-19 materials for as well. And then we ended up having resources translated into 20 plus languages, with local CBOs and communities being able to express what languages were needed, what dialects were needed. And then a few examples of some specific guides that we created. We had a disaster guide for people experiencing homelessness, as well as a disaster guide for farm workers, recognizing that I think in California and also many parts of Oregon at this point, that these are two pretty unique communities that have specific disaster preparedness needs as well. So yeah.
Thank you, Nika. Thank you so much. So I will be sharing the perspective of CBO, a community-based organization, involvement in the campaign. As you all know, the community-based organizations demonstrates effectiveness because they represent the community, they support the community where they live, and they hire people from their own community. So we receive a part of this grant, part of this money to serve San Bernardino and Riverside counties, 2 counties in the state. San Bernardino is the largest county in the United States. So it's a lot of demographic and very big. So we recruit 19 CBOs, community-based organizations, from the faith-based organizations, faith-based, youth, Asian American, Native American, and Native American business sectors, and we came together to start developing the strategies in how to implement this campaign locally in our county. So we ended up having 18 community-based organizations working on our leadership locally. And these CBOs were selected because they are leaders from their own community. They know how to reach the most vulnerable communities. Thank you. They live in the communities that they serve. That was the most important thing that we started finding, how to recruit these CBOs. It was like by invitation. So we invited to apply based on the mapping of the needs of the community. The CBOs use the best practice in how to reach and educate communities. As you know, community-based organizations, they fill the gaps of underserved communities. And also they deep structural capacity to address health disparities in their own communities. So after we recruit all of the CBOs, all of the partners to get together, we develop a training internally, but also we invite our county serve people to really come to our meetings and develop a training. And they did a 3 days training to all of our staff, really in how to provide support to the community in case something happened, and also the messaging how to really do it. So it was intensive training for these individuals. They were working in the campaign. Next slide. Another thing that we did in terms of the implementing the community, the planning for this, we invite the CBOs leaders of those when they are trust, because they have a strong relationship within the communities. So we invite them to come together and say, okay, let's see what is the best approach. Because one of the things that we really want to do was develop our own a campaign. Even though the state already give us some directions, we really want to know, okay, how we can do this, because one strategy can work in one community, but maybe it's not working in another community. Maybe this flagger or this anything that we develop can work for one community and maybe it's not working for another. So we invite them because to really participate in these engagement opportunities, creating these opportunities with the community, and also start thinking about how we can really reflect and analyze what is happening in our communities and how we can find a better solution and how to be prepared better for an emergency. And it was a powerful exercise. Even though it was some not clear understanding from some of the CBOs. For example, one of the business sector CBO that we recruit, they told us, we are not part of this because this is health topic related. So we are not a CBO health related. We don't do health related work in our community because they be more like a business support. But I told them this is very important. And actually, at the end of the project, they were so happy because we were able to engage businesses in the planning and how they can incorporate emergency planning in their own agencies. Amazon was one of them. They ended up inviting us to have a presentation for all of the staff and how to be ready. So I think it was super powerful, inviting those entities to the conversation, even though at the beginning they were like rejected. And also let the community define how to do this. So it was a powerful exercise, and they say, let's do this way or let's do it another way. I'm gonna share some of that in the next slide. So I think that was super important process that we did, community, and then we influence coalitions, and then also we start influencing policy makers to really engage in our local campaign in our counties. So you can go to the next one, Enika. So we invite also community groups from farm workers, seniors, youth, immigrants, non-English speaking, and explore to see if they understand what it means emergency preparedness. So that was the first exercise. And the second was to validate the messaging that was given by the state to do the work. And then and they really start providing a lot of feedback, and then to make sure, because one of the things that we know is that just translating a document or a flyer or a communication message is not enough really to be cultural and linguistic sensitive. So it was for us super important to really validate all of the materials that were given to us to do the work. And it was good exercise. And we came up with a few ideas that I want to share right now. I just want to share some of the process, but also, so for example, next slide. So for example, the campaign, the preparedness campaign from the state, you can move the next slide, Nika, please. It was simplified to 5 steps. It was 5 steps based from the state they are intended to guide everyone to take actions. So the first one was get alerts, make a plan, pack back, go back and get your bag prepared, help friends and neighbors together. So they developed the five steps. So we came with for example, with the Latino community, and we developed kind of dichos or sayings, community sayings. Instead to say the translation, for example, get alerts, we decide to, like, for example, use one saying where it says, no dejes para mañana lo que puede ser hoy. So don't let what you have to do today for tomorrow. And that was very powerful to use in the communities. So it was super powerful, and how the community reflect on it. So for example, also we develop educational and promotion items with the 5 steps, and we start giving out to the community. We include social media graphics, billboards, masks, banners, magnets. I mean, with the aggressive. And then the beauty of this is each group was telling us what they need. Okay, why we don't change this picture for this group, or why we don't modify this for this. And all of the agencies were in door to door, in churches, food banks, shopping centers, supermarkets, laundry mats. I mean, apartment complex, and many more. And also we did a door-to-door door-to-door campaign, specific zip codes that were in the need and most affect from the fires, for example. Also, we did a lot of youth engagement, and we have a youth engagement group what really was very active in reaching their own youth. So they developed their own materials, and we drop off food. So it was the pandemic, and then at the same time that we were doing the information about COVID, dropping off food, for example, we would put in the 5 steps and information where they can go and find information on the 5 steps. Another thing that we do, next slide, it was kind of education. We develop educational materials like games and activities. So for example, with the like, for example, bingo or loteria in Spanish, it was a game that we play with family, and as you play, you can learn. It was super powerful receiving this feedback from the community, and really like, hey, I remember playing with my mom and with my dad about the 5 steps. After 3 or 4 months, when we come back to ask them, either were prepared, they were thinking, they were not really remember the flyer, but the game, for example, they were so engaged And it was really very, very good things that we developed in order to reach the community. When we did a tabling, for example, in a health fair or in a church, or even in a business, we put not just the flyers, but also like a game, and we have prizes. So they need to do the spin, and they need to respond the question. It was about emergency preparedness, and they get the prize. It was super engaged, and that was powerful from the community perspective in order to really help their community. So it was very, very good in terms of that. Let's go to the next one. Also, we developed a local. Initially it was a local song for our Listos disaster preparedness song, and then ended up to be a statewide anthem, like for the Listos campaign. And then it was very good. It's in Spanish and English, and the community decided to put like a little dance on it, which we're going to be put the link on it. And we invite emergency preparedness managers to participate in the videos. We invite elected officials. We invite, so it was a lot of good collaboration in order to like have all of these leaderships and these departments to really send a message to the community that is super important to be on the same page in regards to this, be prepared for an emergency. We developed the puppet show. So it was a puppet, very good for the community as well, for kids and youth. We would invite to churches and to do online too. So it was a powerful campaign. I think internally has been the lead in the region for implementing this campaign. We see a lot of transformation within our own agency, but also with another CBOs. So I think the CBOs that we work with, we really reflect on it, and we saw a growth, building capacity was given to the CBOs in order to do this work, and let them to decide what is the best approach in regards to to do this. And then I think this approach has been really powerful in our end. So thank you for having me. I think this is my last slide, and then I'm gonna let Nika to take over, and I will be here to answer any of the questions that you may have regarding to the CBO's involvement on this.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. And hopefully you all can see me okay. For some reason, I'm not showing. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so just to kind of briefly, we already mentioned, some of the players that were involved. But just wanted to kind of, I think, shout out again, so much the importance of the relationship building. I think that we definitely at the state level had a lot to work on in terms of really having meaningful conversations with folks on the ground and at the local level and the county level, and really taking the time to listen to, county emergency managers, as well as nonprofits and CBOs that had been maybe involved with disaster work before, and also folks that had never been engaged before, and trying to figure out some of those relationships ended up being really important. Working with the public health department became extremely important, especially during COVID and COVID messaging. I think that that's just, again, one of the big emergencies and disasters of our time, and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. So developing more of the relationship with them as well was super important in terms of creating messaging that aligned across state departments. And then, finally, just shouting out again the importance of working with the private sector. As I mentioned at one point, we even worked with some tech companies. We actually were able to develop a partnership with an app to do all of our data collection, and they created a system and an app specifically for us to be able to do that and to be able to track all of the things that we were doing, which was really incredible. We partnered with like we mentioned before, media. So worked with PBS, for instance, PBS Kids, to do disaster preparedness materials for them. Worked with Telemundo and Univision, with Black media, lots of different folks, Hmong radio stations, to make sure that PSAs were getting out and information was getting out. And then finally, foundations. As we also mentioned, of course, resources are always needed, especially for us on the research side, making sure that we were really understanding the layout and the environment that we were getting into on multiple levels. I also just wanted to mention, sorry, on the last thing, that it was also a case of sustainability. So also ensuring that relationships were made that were sustainable outside of our campaign at the time. So if folks were able to build relationships also through the process, that when our funding potentially ran out, that those relationships would be made and things would be able to be a little bit more sustainable that way. So in terms of next steps for this and what we're talking about now. So like we said before, this group actually isn't wedded to, for instance, doing or replicating a Listos California campaign in Oregon. It's much more just to show a model that was used in a neighboring state facing some similar disaster challenges, and what we were able to do with communities and collaboration. For us, currently right now, what we're looking at in terms of next steps is going through a planning process through a planning grant that includes doing a statewide assessment of what is already happening, what materials are already out there, doing focus groups, interviews, and a final report to see potentially what is needed or isn't needed in Oregon, and what spaces still need to be filled. All of this, is in the hopes of ensuring that Oregon's most vulnerable populations have the emergency preparedness materials that they need, and making sure that they have those materials in culturally, linguistically accessible ways. Each phase is really going to be grounded in some core values, which include equity, transparency, inclusivity, participation, curiosity, and collaboration. And those are really going to be the backbone for everything that we do moving forward. In terms of ways that we're hoping to get folks involved, and hopefully some of you all that are on this call, is we do plan on doing some focus groups, as well as participatory interviews and surveys, all of which will lend themselves, again, to helping us understand what's already happening. What are folks already doing in this field and in this sector? And where are there potentially still some areas that need to be built out a little bit more, have additional resources added, have additional manpower added, or is it just room for connectivity between folks that are doing similar projects already? So all of that will be compiled through some data analysis and a final report, like I mentioned before, that all of you will also be able to have access to if you would like or find that of interest. And again, in all of those steps, definitely looking for participation from folks like you all.
Yeah, I think this is time for questions. I think we could come back together into the tiny screens. Yes, and whoever feels comfortable either asking questions through the chat or unmuting. Thank you, Nika and Alex, for providing one example of, what it could look like. And really, it's impressive to have so much various multi-sector support behind a campaign or an initiative, to really give it that feel of, collaboration, and the idea of building more trust and relationships between various sectors, to me, is really important, because I have direct, being someone who also co-manages in an LTRG and understanding like how we're all impacted through the messaging and the relationships that I've built in various parts of the disaster sector. To me, this would be a key way for us to understand a little bit more of how can we do things better, and what are some best practices that we can potentially adopt. So would love to hear from you all, and feel free to keep your video on or off or whatever works. I'm gonna mute, so if someone has questions or follow-ups, they can go ahead and take some space.
Okay, we got a question in the chat by Jan, who ended up being the key identifiers of vulnerable communities and any identified that you didn't expect.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We were actually, as probably also a lot of you on this call know, you end up getting held to whatever legislation is kind of passed and what the wording is in the policy. So in terms of what were the identifiers of vulnerable communities, I think that really came from feedback that especially state legislatures were hearing from their constituents. So for us, in the context of Listos, California, that ended up primarily being the non-English speaking communities, folks that had access and functional needs, folks in the aging population, lower income folks, and then folks living in rural areas was really what we ended up identifying as kind of the 5 main buckets, as well as people of diverse kind of ethnic backgrounds, which in California is not minority, is majority. So those were kind of what we initially looked at as vulnerable communities. I think what was really interesting, especially when we were doing some of the population mapping that I was discussing, was, even looking at income, right? And saying, okay, low income communities are a vulnerable population for different reasons. Really looking at what that